When people talk about aging, they often paint a picture filled with serene afternoons on the porch, laughter with grandchildren, and leisurely vacations. But behind the curtain, there are truths about getting older that rarely make it into those cheerful conversations. Some of them are awkward, some surprising, and some just plain hard to talk about. This is the story of 12 ugly things that often come with age, told through the lives of a group of friends in the small town of Maplewood, each of whom has faced a part of this reality in their own way. Eleanor Harris had always been the picture of dignity. In her younger years, she had taught literature at the local high school, her voice always calm and her clothes pressed to perfection. But now at 79, Eleanor was starting to notice a new version of herself emerging, one she wasn't entirely comfortable with. She forgot where she put her keys almost daily. She'd walk into the kitchen with a clear purpose, only to stand there, lost, staring at the refrigerator door. "It's not that I'm losing my mind," she'd reassure herself. "It's just age." But in the quiet of the night, she admitted to her daughter, Emily, "It's frustrating. You feel like you're betraying yourself." Forgetfulness was creeping in, not dramatically, but enough to sting her pride. Meanwhile, across town, George Whitman, an 82-year-old retired mechanic, had a different battle. George had always prided himself on being able to fix anything, from tractors to coffee makers. But lately, his hands shook when he tried to thread a screw, and his back ached after just bending over the hood of his old Chevy. The physical changes didn't just slow him down, they changed the way people looked at him. His son, Jake, would say, "Dad, don't strain yourself. Let me do it." Meant with love, it felt like pity to George. The hardest part was not the pain, but the slow surrender of the independence he'd valued his whole life. Not far from George lived Martha Reynolds, a 75-year-old widow who was once the life of every neighborhood block party. She still loved people, but she had a secret she didn't often share: loneliness. Her friends had moved away or passed on, and though her two sons called occasionally, their lives were busy. Some weeks, the only real conversation she had was with the cashier at the grocery store. Martha would sit in her living room in the evenings, television humming in the background, and feel the weight of silence pressing in. Loneliness wasn't just an empty calendar, it was a slow erosion of joy. Earl Johnson, at 77, dealt with something far less sentimental and far more embarrassing: changes in personal hygiene. He didn't neglect himself on purpose. But bending to trim his toenails became a chore, and sometimes he forgot to change his shirt if he wasn't going anywhere. His daughter, Melissa, once gently pulled him aside and said, "Dad, you've got to keep up with these things." It stung, but he knew she was right. Aging often makes simple tasks unexpectedly difficult, and pride can make it harder to ask for help. On the other side of Maplewood, Grace Simmons was discovering the unsettling reality of emotional unpredictability. Once steady and even-tempered, Grace found herself tearing up over small things: a sad commercial, a memory of her late husband, even seeing a neighbor's child ride a bike for the first time. "I'm not sad all the time," she'd tell her friend Eleanor. "It's just like my heart's closer to the surface now." Grace's emotions weren't a sign of weakness, but they made her feel less in control, and that was new territory for her. Walter Brooks, a retired firefighter in his early 80s, had his own silent frustration: digestive troubles. He'd never had issues with food before, but now meals he once enjoyed left him uncomfortable. Spicy chili, greasy burgers, even a simple cup of coffee sometimes led to regret. He started eating earlier in smaller portions and keeping a bottle of antacids in his pocket. "My stomach didn't used to boss me around," he joked to George, though deep down it didn't feel funny. Then there was Donna Clark, 78, who found herself speaking without thinking more often than she liked. She'd been known for her tact all her life, but now she occasionally blurted out thoughts without fully filtering them. It wasn't malice. It was just as if the gap between her thoughts and her mouth had shrunk. Once, at a church luncheon, she made an offhand remark about a young woman's haircut being a bit wild, and the awkward silence that followed made her realize her old verbal self-control wasn't as sharp as it once was. Arthur Miller, a 76-year-old who had lived alone for the past decade, noticed another ugly truth: clutter creeping into his home. He didn't think of himself as a hoarder, but over the years, he found it harder to keep up with cleaning. Old magazines piled up. Tools he never used again gathered dust in corners. He told himself he'd sort it all next week, but weeks became months. It wasn't laziness, just the gradual decline in stamina and motivation that aging can bring. For Linda Peterson, 74, it was her hearing. She hated admitting it, but she'd started missing parts of conversations, especially in noisy places. Sometimes she nodded and smiled, hoping it was an appropriate response, only to realize later she'd misunderstood. The idea of wearing hearing aids embarrassed her, but the alternative, feeling left out, was worse. Tommy Richards, at 81, experienced something he never expected, his circle of friends shrinking not just because of distance or loss, but because he sometimes pushed people away without meaning to. He'd grown impatient, quicker to snap when someone was late or when plans changed. "I just don't have the energy for nonsense," he'd say, but afterward, he felt a pang of regret. The truth was, age had made him more set in his ways, and that rigidity sometimes cost him connections. Betty Andrews, 79, dealt with a more private struggle, losing her sense of purpose. After retiring from her career as a nurse, she thought she'd fill her days with hobbies, but over time, those interests faded. She woke up some mornings wondering why she even bothered to get dressed. "When you stop working, people stop needing you," she confided to her neighbor, Grace. It wasn't depression, exactly. It was the slow fading of identity, replaced by a quieter, less defined life. And finally, there was Frank Dawson, 83, who battled something he rarely spoke about: fear. Not the loud kind of fear, but the quiet one that lingered in his mind at night. Fear of falling. Fear of running out of money. Fear of being alone in a medical emergency. Frank had faced plenty of challenges in life, but this quiet undercurrent of worry felt different. It wasn't about bravery. It was about knowing your body and circumstances were changing, and some of those changes were beyond your control. These 12 ugly parts of aging: forgetfulness, physical decline, loneliness, hygiene struggles, emotional unpredictability, digestive troubles, loss of verbal filter, clutter, hearing loss, impatience, loss of purpose, and quiet fears, were not the whole story of these seniors' lives, but they were real. And as each of them learned in their own way, the only way to face these truths was with honesty, humor, and connection. Eleanor began writing lists for everything, even putting sticky notes on the fridge to remind her what she'd meant to do. George let Jake help with the heavy work.